Good morning, everyone. Welcome to another edition of Inquisition Update. My name's Tom Fress, and I'll be your host for the next hour. You're listening to FirstAmendmentRadio.com. Thanks for tuning in, everyone. We're going to continue now our reading and discussion of the book Rome and Civil Liberty by J.A. Wiley. This portion of the book is entitled The Troubler of Europe. Who was it that had troubled Europe so much during the time of the writing of this book? Well, James A. Wiley is going to tell us. And it is the result of a review of about 1,000 years of history that James A. Wiley and the Parliament of Great Britain come to the realization of who that troubler really was. And we're going to find out who that troubler was, and that troubler is still the troubler of the world today. As a matter of fact, this chapter of the book is just as relevant to us today as it was to them at the time of its writing. And the only thing that might change is the title of this chapter. Rather than the troubler of Europe, it might just as well read the troubler of the world. This chapter is also not only going to tell us who that troubler is, it's going to tell us how vital it is, the study of history, for our full comprehension and realization of the fulfillment of Bible prophecy. Bible prophecy is simply history told in advance. And the only way to comprehend the fulfillment of Bible prophecy is to see that fulfillment in history. The Parliament of Great Britain took upon itself the study of 1,000 years of history to try to explain the trouble that currently troubled Europe and where that trouble came from. It's very instructive, and we would learn from it today. So we'll begin at the bottom of page 255 if you're following along on your online copy of the book. James A. Wiley says, in the March of 1859, just before the breaking out of the war in Italy, a discussion took place in Parliament touching the disquiet that prevailed in Europe, in the course of which certain great truths were enunciated, which the world at large, and Great Britain in particular, would do well deeply to ponder. Providence, capital P, works out its grand problems in the slow course of 1,000 years, and gives them such breadth and prominence that they remain lessons for the race to all time. Of such a nature were the problems brought into view by the discussion to which we refer. They were the summings up of history, the teachings of 1,000 years, the solemn utterances of the great ruler, capital G, capital R, meaning God, verified by the nations of Europe who had exemplified, some to their prosperity and others to their ruin, the truths of the principles proclaimed. Often had these principles been put before the world in the form of theological dogmas, but now they were presented as well-ascertained political experiences and announced from a stage fitted to give them universal publicity. The discussion, indeed, was a great sermon spoken to the world, illustrating the great facts, the principles of divine government, and the essential conditions of the prosperity of peoples. All parties in Parliament were at one on this point. They found Europe ill at ease, deeply troubled, its nations weighed down by forebodings and political terrors. They inquired the cause of this political and social feverishness. They all, one after one, Lord Palmerston, Mr. Disraeli, Lord John Russell, put their finger upon the same spot and said, "Here is the seat of the mischief. Here lurks the malady that torments the body politic. It is at Rome and nowhere else that those fires smolder that threaten to rend Europe in pieces. If in France Every forge, every arsenal, every port rings with warlike preparations. If cannons are being bored, if transports are being manned, if regiments are being put on a war footing, if in Austria column after column is being marched to the Ticino, in stores, arms, and soldiers are being poured into the great fortress that guard the Mincio, the Po, and the Adriatic. If everywhere to the remotest extremity of Europe men are whetting the sword and the trumpet is calling to battle, it is Rome that has awakened all this stir and marshaled all these armies. It is the perpetual, incurable, unbearable misgovernment of the papacy that has brought on this vast danger. Had a Protestant controversialist asserted that the grand disease of Europe was the papacy, and that unless this disease was eradicated, it would work, and that speedily, to ruin the system, he would have been little heeded. It would have been said that his theological hatreds were distorting his views and conjuring up before his mind imaginary terrors. But when the great statesmen of England say the same thing, their words must command attention. No theological animosities, no sectarian prejudices have misled them. They have formed their opinions simply as statesmen. They find Europe heaving like ocean before the coming storm. They cast anxious eyes around. They examine every point of the horizon to see where it is the tempest gathers. As one man, they point to the Vatican. It is there, they all exclaim, the dark cloud so fearfully charged with lightning rises. The great troubler of the world is Rome. Popery. This purely spiritual thing, as many affect to regard it, has within the past 40 years broken the peace of Europe not fewer than a score of times. Let us recall the more prominent of these instances. In 1823, the Netherlands government had to step in and dissolve two religious confederacies dangerous to the state. In 1824, the tranquility of Bavaria, Saxe-Weimar, and Saxony was disturbed by religious commotions. In 1825, we find the Bishop of Malines in conflict with the Belgian government. In 1827, the pretensions of the court of Rome were too much for even the bigoted Ferdinand of Spain, and he had to bar his kingdom to the nuncio of the Pope. The same year, the Jesuits in Belgium, allying themselves with the radicals, whom they hated, effected a revolution and expelled a Protestant king, at the same time that their brethren in Saxony were creating disturbances by plotting in the opposite interest. In 1830, Charles X, listening to Jesuit advisors, published the famous ordinances which lost him his throne. In 1834, we find the bishops of Spain supporting the Carlist insurrection and drawing down upon themselves the chastisement of their government. In 1837, the Archbishop of Cologne was in open rebellion against his sovereign, the King of Prussia. In 1838, the Austrian bishops prevailed on the government to banish the entire population of the Zellerthal, who had become Protestants. In 1842, the bishops of France made war against the government universities, as their brethren in Ireland did at a later period. Their next exploit in the same country was to originate the expedition to Tahiti to root out the Protestant missions. a step which had well nigh drawn on a war between the two countries of France and Britain. In 1847, the War of the Sunderbund, which convulsed Switzerland, grew out of the machinations of the Jesuits. In 1850, we had the quarrel between the Archbishop Franzoni and the court of Turin, which we have already described. We have had since that time several risings of the Piedmontese peasantry at the instigation of their cures. The brigandage, which since 1859 has been the terror of the Neapolitan territory, has been clearly traced to the court of the Vatican. Of late years, Louis Napoleon has been compelled, on more than one occasion, to nip conspiracies in the bud by dissolving secret Jesuit confederacies. And not to prolong our enunciation, and not to prolong our enumeration, it has been suspected, on no slight grounds, that the war now raging in Poland was planned and set on foot by the Jesuits. Certain it is that it has received their active sympathy. This is a long list of troubles, commotions, and civil conflicts in a period so short. But if the Church of Rome has been found to be so ceaseless an intriguer against the independence of nations, and so perpetual a disturber of their peace in Catholic countries, she will be tenfold more so in Great Britain, where a measure of liberty unknown in the despotic kingdoms is allowed to all parties. Yet here she has set up her government, legislative and executive, and now she claims the right to carry out her Roman Catholic canon law under the plea of toleration. In fact, Rome has transplanted her seat from the banks of the Tiber to the banks of the Thames. How dearly do nations buy their knowledge, and how unwilling are they to see those great truths which the Bible has plainly revealed. Not till disappointment, disaster, suffering prolonged, it may be, through many centuries, has taught them how true the Bible is, do they own the soundness of its maxims and the force of its warnings. The Protestant Reformation would have abolished by peaceable means the idolatrous faith and tyrannical government which have so long had their seat at Rome. The Reformers warned Europe what the issue would be: bloody wars and terrible uprisings. The warning was derided. "No," said the kings of Europe, "the papacy shall not be abolished." The majority of the nations of the continent said the same thing, and they continued to wear its yoke, never dreaming that a day would come when that yoke, which then crushed only religious men, would overwhelm themselves. Some millions of lives were sacrificed that the papacy might be preserved. And what is the reward which the kings of the nations of Europe have received from her whom they preserved at so vast a cost? Has she enriched their kingdoms? Has she consolidated their power? Has she diffused knowledge and loyalty among her subjects? Has she given quiet and peace to the world? Has she not wrought the very evils which the Reformers said she would inevitably work, only on a scale immensely more stupendous than even they dared to anticipate? Has not the popish faith ruined the intelligence, blighted the industry, annihilated the commerce, destroyed the loyalty of every nation in which it has been retained? Has it not extinguished the light of art and science, and shrouded the papal Europe of the 19th century in the barbarism of the 13th? Has it not dug a mine below every throne, and suspended a sword above every dwelling? And now, its oppressions rising to a pitch which makes them no longer endurable, it has hung the nations of Europe on the, quote, perilous edge of battle, unquote, a battle which, if one may judge from the unprecedented scale of the preparations, will be such as the world has never before seen. Have not the kings and nations of Europe been expending their treasures and sacrificing their best subjects to preserve their own destroyer, the great Moloch of Europe? The great Moloch of Europe? James A. Wiley is putting the blame squarely where it belongs, on the great Moloch of Europe, the papacy. And that's where it resides today. Do not we see the world situated for war? Do we not see nations armed to the teeth, threatening, advancing on other nations, preparing for war, speaking of war, planning for war, financing war, all over the world? And who might we blame for the world being situated for war? The great Moloch of Europe, the papacy. He said, would it not have been better to have listened to the Protestant reformers 3 centuries ago? Even 10 years ago? Would it not have been better to have left the papacy to the fate to which the Protestant Revolution appeared to have consigned it? Instead of this, Louis Napoleon employed his armies to restore it to its old seat of prestige at Rome. A British ministry looked quietly on. Lord Palmerston defended the step. And now both the Emperor of the French and the statesmen of Britain confess that what they then did was a great blunder. That the government they restored at such expense of life and money has misgoverned and oppressed its subjects, is in short a thing so dangerous to the public peace and so scandalous to the modern ideas that what they went to war to restore, they must now go to war to abolish. Such is the plain English of all that they are now saying and doing. Could there be testimony more triumphant to the essential wisdom and beneficent spirit of Protestantism? Or could confession be plainer that a mighty error was committed when the Protestant Reformation was rejected, and that the long succession of revolutions and wars which has since passed over Europe, and of which as yet she sees not the close, is but the penalty of her great transgression of 3 centuries ago? But if our statesmen really believe what they say, then how comes it that they have been striving by a lavish expenditure of the public money to foster in Britain that very influence which they tell us has destroyed Italy? This is an anomaly which we beg they would explain to us. They either believe or they do not believe the charge they prefer when they lay at the door of the papacy the fearful disorganization and misery that reign in the Roman states, and the fatal embroilment into which the continent has now come. If they do not believe it, they are maligners of the pontifical government. If they do believe it, they are conspirators against Britain. They can choose whichever horn of the dilemma they please on which to do penance. If there is a government in the world which might confidently reckon on being left undisturbed by the plottings of Rome, surely it is the government of France. Louis Napoleon keeps the Vatican for the Pope and the city of Rome for the papacy, despite the wishes of the Italians and the protestations of the rest of Europe. He has lately undertaken, at the instigation of the Jesuits, the conquest of Mexico, and there restored the dominancy of the priests. All over the East, French diplomacy and Jesuit missions are advancing hand in hand. In fact, it is a grand papal aggression which is being prosecuted at this hour under the banners of the empire. These are substantial services. Yet this very government, which is doing its utmost to serve them, the priests are embroiling by their intrigues for pontifical absolutism. Their object is to deal the coup de grace to the Gallican liberties by the introduction into France of the Roman liturgy. The old liturgies of France are the expression more or less of Gallicanism. But the Roman liturgy, which Pope Pius IX and Cardinal de Bonald insist on introducing into that country, contains the Hildebrandine doctrine of the Pope's right to depose emperors and kings. Now, a little explanation might be necessary to some of my listeners. The Gallican Church of France is a Roman Catholic church. But the Roman Catholic Church in France demanded that if the papacy must remain as the spiritual head of the Roman Catholic Church, then he must give up his authority over the government of France. And the Gallican Roman Catholics were willing to obey the Pope in spiritual things, but they absolutely would not tolerate any interference whatsoever from the papacy against the government of the country. All right, they gave flesh and bones to what we know as the separation of church and state. And the Gallican Church of France still exists today. And what they preserved for themselves in the separating of church and state was liberties, civil liberties, which are not enjoyed in other Roman Catholic countries. The Gallican Catholics were regarded as rebels and schismatics. But Rome had to tolerate them, at least for a time, because she couldn't do anything about them. All right? There are still Catholics in the Roman Catholic Church that demand a wall of separation between the church and their pope and the government of the country. Would to God they had a greater voice in this country today. Would to God that they recognize just how much the papacy controls the government of the United States today. There might well be another Reformation of Roman Catholics, another revolution of Roman Catholics against their papacy. And they might join forces with Protestants to restore our liberties. Okay, we've come up on the break. We'll continue where we left off here when we come back from the messages. You're listening to Inquisition Update on First Amendment Radio, and we'll be back right after this.
The program you are listening to is 100% sponsored by you, the listener, on this First Amendment Rights Media channel. You will notice that there are few commercials on this radio network. There's a good reason for that. Corporate advertising dollars come with strings that limit program content. So without your help, these programs cannot continue on internet or our several affiliates. If you benefit by the educational law programs, we ask you to give. If you are admonished or nurtured by the Bible and ministry programs, we ask you to give. If some voice a cause that you are passionate about, we ask you to give. If you believe in any of these, we ask you to support them as you would a missionary on a continual basis, as if giving a tithe for missionary radio. These programs are not commercially viable and must be supported by those faithful to the cause of truth. Look for the button to sponsor your favorite programs at our listen and schedule pages on the internet. Then, when you subscribe, we will send you the last quarterly MP3 CD of that program immediately, and continue to do so with each new quarter. We will also give you unlimited archive access to all of our programs. We're asking you to give much less than a tithe, so that you may also send support directly to a particular program host, cause, and anywhere else the Spirit may lead you. Do all to the glory of our God and Creator, for His holy nation, the only kingdom that will last forever. Thank you for listening.
Visit crosstheborder.org, CROSS, crosstheborder.org, to get your print, EPUB, or PDF version of the book, The Rapture Will Be Canceled. That's crosstheborder.org.
I know you all want answers, and believe me, so do I, and I'll do my best to get them.
Despite Nicolas Cage's promise to do his best to get left behind rapture answers for us, don't hold your breath. Not everyone believes Left Behind is true prophecy. Some may even regard as conspiratorial the mainstream re-release of the Left Behind movie with actor Nicolas Cage portraying the main character as an attempt to further reinforce in the minds of all this perception of false prophecy in order to condition the masses for the play about to begin. If you want true Bible prophecy answers, get the book, The Rapture Will Be Canceled. The author exposes the Latin rapture origin, the 7-year tribulation deception, true Bible revelation of Daniel's 70 weeks, the abomination of desolation, the restrainer, America in the Revelation, the image of the beast and the mark of the beast, and the truth about God's chosen people, and so much more about Bible prophecy. This book will shatter the Left Behind paradigm of future events. Get the book, The Rapture Will Be Canceled. Visit crosstheborder.org, CROSS, crosstheborder.org, to get your print, EPUB, or PDF version of the book, The Rapture Will Be Canceled. That's crosstheborder.org.
Welcome back from the break. You're listening to the second half hour of Inquisition Update on First Amendment Radio. If you'd like to support Inquisition Update and keep Inquisition Update on this network, please support First Amendment Radio, who sponsors the program. And if you'd like to contact me, please do so by email. My email address is tom@seawaves.us. Now, as we said before the break, the old liturgies of France were the expression, more or less, of Gallicanism. In other words, the forms of worship practiced in the Roman Catholic churches of France were different than the rest of the Roman Catholic countries in Europe. Gallicanism taught and maintained very successfully that the Pope should rule over spiritual things, but the king should rule over the civil government, and that the papacy should not interfere with civil government in France. The Pope can be Pope as long as he stays within those bounds. But the minute the Pope steps over the line and starts treading on the territory belonging to the king, then the Gallicans rose up against the papacy. And it was the Jesuits who constantly tried to assert papal authority over the government, over the King of France, and to unite church and state in France. So the Jesuits hated the Gallicans, and the Gallicans hated the Jesuits. And because of the strength and influence of the Gallicans, France eventually evicted the Jesuits from the country. So there'd been a war in France almost perpetually over the status of the Pope over the civil government of France. Now it says the old liturgies, the old sermons preached in the French Gallican churches were the expression, more or less, of Gallicanism, separation of church and state. But the Roman liturgy, which Pope Pius IX, the current pope at the time, and Cardinal de Bonald insist on introducing into that country, contains the Hildebrandine doctrine, that is, the doctrine of Pope Hildebrand, the Pope's right to depose emperors and kings. Okay? So they tried to to trash can the Gallican liturgies and replace Roman liturgies in France, which taught Hildebrandism, Pope Hildebrand's doctrine, that the Pope has a divine right over the emperors and the kings of the earth. The King of Kings and Lord of Lords. Okay? Now he says the matter, after long smoldering in secret, has now come to open war. The Pope has published at Rome a brief. This is one form of papal dictatorial proclamation, a brief, empowering the use of the Roman liturgy in the churches of the Diocese of Lyons, and the Emperor, by a decree in the Monture Officielle, that is an official publication, has forbidden the publication of the brief. So here is the war taking place between the government of France and the papacy. Papacy says, I rule over all, even the civil government, and the government says, no, you rule over spiritual things, and I rule sovereignly over the civil things. Now, it says, despite the opposition of the government, the priests have adopted the obnoxious liturgy in other parts of France. And in this way does the Pope repay Louis Napoleon for his great services. This dispute teaches great lessons on the head of national independence. The kingdom that allows appeals to Rome or freely admits the briefs of the Pope loses self-government. Let me read it again. And ask yourself when I'm reading this, where does the United States stand in all this? The kingdom that allows appeals to Rome or freely admits the briefs of the Pope loses self-government. Okay? So you would instantly recall that the United States has lost self-government because it allows Rome to issue briefs to its priests here in the United States of America. And those briefs and bulls and encyclicals and pastoral letters have everything to do with instigating a conformity of the civil law to Roman Catholic canon law. It's called synodical action. Okay? Now he says the kingdom that allows appeals to Rome or freely admits the briefs of the Pope loses self-government. So the United States is no longer self-governing. The people have nothing to say about the government anymore. The government is ruled over by the papacy, just as was France. When the kingdom beseeched Rome to rule on certain issues, it merely accepted the papacy's authority over civil things, over the civil power. And the papacy always acts on that assertion and takes over the civil government. Now he says that very power, which the emperor awes in its own capital, is nevertheless seen to be, through the machinery of appeals and bulls, the real ruler of France. Louis Napoleon holds Rome by his shoulders, but Pope Pius XII holds France through the Jesuits. So we got the same struggle going on in England at the time of the writing of this book, and we've got the same situation, the same struggle for control taking place in the United States today. And I say there's not much struggle anymore. As a matter of fact, there's so little struggle that it's never even been publicly identified that the papacy has taken over the government. And for fear of starting a religious war in this country, everyone on both sides of the issue will skirt around it or deny it openly if they have to. They don't want to see the United States go up in a civil war, Protestants against Catholics, because that's likely to be a war of annihilation. And nobody wants to be responsible for the implosion, the religious implosion of the United States. And after all, for the papacy to be able to perform its phony 70th week of Daniel on Mount Moriah in Jerusalem, and to assist in this global conquest, to make that eventuality a possibility, the United States has to have all of its focus on Islam. And to shift the focus away from Islam onto Roman Catholicism would be destruction of the Pope's hopeful plans for Jerusalem, and the building of a temple, and the uniting of the three Abrahamic faiths on Mount Moriah in Jerusalem. But we can take it from history, 1,000 years of history, what really ails this country and what really ails the world. And until the United States and the world come to this realization through the study of history, we cannot possibly comprehend that prophecy has been fulfilled. And so we look for a future fulfillment when it's being fulfilled right before our very eyes. Rome controlled France through the Jesuits. And likewise, Rome controls the United States through the Jesuits, just like Rome controlled Britain through the Jesuits. It's Rome that's fomenting all these wars. Rome cannot achieve her end-time ends, her futurist ends, without perpetual war. War is the dynamic that advances the church's agenda in the world, that makes papal intervention necessary. Conflict. The Roman Catholic Church, at rest and at peace, has no dynamo through which to promote her agenda. And so Rome foments the wars, manages both sides of the conflict, and in so doing prepares for the next war, and the next war, and the next war, and to ultimately, through war, achieve her agenda. And that is a phony refulfillment of Daniel's 70th week, as recorded in Daniel chapter 9. And the British government, even at the very time when it was bending over backwards to endow the Roman Catholic Church in England, was having discussions in Parliament assessing the cause for all the unrest in Europe, all the unrest in the world. Even, you just have to know that it was even considered the unrest and the part that the Jesuits and the Roman Catholic Church played in the unrest in the United States of America. I mean, after all, we're talking about 1865, the Civil War. I'm really surprised that James A. Wiley hasn't touched on it so far in the writing. And what conclusion did they come to? That Rome was responsible for all the upheaval, all the turmoil, all the wars, all the disputes, all the assassinations. Rome had a motive in all of them. All the trouble lies in the very lap of the papacy. And yet, Great Britain was trying to endow the Roman Catholic Church on their own soil, allowing the Pope to issue briefs and bulls, allowing the Pope to send bishops to govern dioceses into which they broke up the land, and to literally form a government of, by, and for the Pope in Great Britain. Can you see the delusion? The United States has gone through the same delusion. It lives with it every day and never questions it. What really happened at Vatican Council II? Was it not a repudiation of Protestantism? When it accepted Rome as an equal partner in Christianity with Protestantism, it surrendered Protestantism because they're two opposite churches. One serves Christ, the other serves the papacy, the Antichrist of the Bible. You can't claim to be a Protestant. You have no claim whatsoever on Protestantism if you're seeking a common goal and communion with Rome. You can't serve two masters. The Scripture makes it absolutely plain. We can't call ourselves Protestants and serve the Antichrist. Protestantism protests the Antichrist, the papacy. So what is there really left of Protestantism? You'd have to ask the same question of England at the time of the writing of this book. What has happened to Protestantism? How is the government that calls itself Protestant bending over backwards to endow the Roman Catholic Church, its own assassin, its own inquisitor? And the very same questions are legitimate about the United States and have been more and more legitimately asked as time goes on ever since the founding of this country. Why do we seek fellowship and communion with the Church of Antichrist? Why do we allow our tax dollars to be redistributed by our government to endow the Roman Catholic Church? To take all Protestant literature out of our schools? To make the people of the nation completely ignorant about what the Protestant Reformation was all about? To take out of our schools the entire history of the diabolical nature of the Roman Catholic Church? You know that 1,000 years of history that England was discussing that came to James A. Wiley as the subject of this part of the book? Hasn't that discussion of 1,000 years of history ever been had in the United States of America? And look what good it did England. Even acknowledging that the lesson of 1,000 years was that the papacy is the great troubler of the world. And look what good that realization did England. At the very same time they were endowing the Roman Catholic Church, helping to raise up that very power that would eventually overthrow the Protestant government of Great Britain. Has not the United States of America done the very same thing? Is it not still doing it today? And would it even discuss the matter if it ever came to their attention? It's just a blindness that cannot be penetrated. What hope is there for a nation that intensely intends to commit suicide, spiritual and temporal, by seeking fellowship against that church upon which judgment has already been passed by God Himself? James A. Wiley continues, he says, place the Church of Rome at the top or at the bottom of society. In either position, she is alike dangerous to the peace of kingdoms. Is she low? She becomes a base sycophant, a hypocritical pretender to opinions she abhors, and a vile panderer to the worst passions of the mob. Does she possess restricted political rights? She is a restless intriguer, ever using her liberty to undermine liberty. Does she stand at the summit of society? She is a merciless tyrant. Through these several grades has that church passed since the memorable year of 1848. In that year, she was a Democrat in one country, a constitutionalist in another, and a socialist in a third. The sanguinary Dominic which for ages she had worshipped with the bloody auto de fe, she professed to have forsworn. And now the more grateful task had become hers of sprinkling trees of liberty with holy water and saying Mass for new constitutions. That sanguinary Dominic, what's he referring to here? The Dominican priests who were formed under this Dominic, and their duty was the Inquisition. They were the ones responsible of fulfilling the Bible prophecy that says the Roman Catholic Church is drunk with the blood of the saints and the blood of the martyrs of Jesus. The Dominicans, Dominic, that sanguinary Dominic, which for ages she had worshipped with bloody autos de fe, that is, the public burning of heretics. That's what autos de fe mean. She professed to have forsworn the Inquisition, but it's only a profession. It's a false swearing. She has perjured herself once again. She has never relinquished her divine right to shed the blood of heretics. It is her command to shed the blood of heretics. It is her law, her canon law, to shed the blood of heretics. Should we believe her every time she says she has changed when she swears she never changes? The sanguinary Dominic, which for ages she worshipped with bloody autos de fe, she professed to have forsworn, and now the more grateful task had become hers to sprinkle trees of liberty with holy water and saying Mass for new constitutions. But well she knew all the while what she was about. Under cover of her newborn love of liberalism, she was maturing her plans, and before the trees she had blessed had withered, these plans were ripened. And the signal being given from the Vatican, she and her vassal kings commenced an armed reaction throughout Europe, which issued in the indiscriminate proscription of all rights, political and personal. For 10 years the nations lay groaning in chains 10 times heavier than those which the Revolution of 1848 had broken. Are you losing your liberties today? Who might you suspect to find in history of 1,000 years, who is always opposed to rights? There's no one else but the papacy. That man of sin, that son of perdition, the one that the prophet Daniel spoke of, the one that the prophet Paul spoke of, the one that the prophet John spoke of, that Moloch from Europe. The next portion of the chapter is entitled Development of Jesuitism. The Church of Rome has in our day undergone a remarkable change. The spread of ultramontanism has more thoroughly compacted and knit together that church than she ever was before. Now again, for new listeners who've never heard the term, I'll explain. Ultramontanism, which began to be defined as across the mountains, and it was used to describe a pope that had been elected not from Italy but from Europe. He was an ultramontane. He came from across the mountains to serve as the papacy. It has come to mean the absolute rule of the papacy over both spiritual and temporal things. The Jesuits were created for the very purpose of elevating the papacy to global, spiritual, temporal, economic, every other kind of way, supreme ruler of the world. That's the very purpose for the existence of the Jesuits. Were it not for that purpose, that ultramontane purpose, the Jesuits would not exist today, would never have been created. The Jesuits have one function, and that is to conquer Protestantism so that ultramontanism can find its goal, so that the papacy can rule over the whole earth every man, woman, and child in it. That is the very blood that courses through the veins of every Jesuit. That is their very purpose. If they ever lose their purpose, they lose their right for existence. And the papacy knows that if it ever has a hope in Hades of ruling over God's creation and every man, woman, and child in it, it must have the service of the Jesuits. Only they have demonstrated their capability of doing it. Only they have demonstrated their capability of first destroying Protestantism through futurism and then conquering by using formerly Protestant nations at their own expense to conquer the rest of the world, including the Middle East, for the papacy. That's what ultramontanism means. Supreme ruler, the papacy. All right, the Church of Rome has in our day undergone a remarkable change. The spread of ultramontanism has more thoroughly compacted and knit together that church than she ever was before. In other words, the Jesuits have united the Roman Catholic Church more than she ever was before. And we're going to show how they took a divided church and made it a one solid knit church for one purpose and one purpose only. It's a very powerful instruction in history, and we'll continue it next week. We've come upon the end of the program. My regrets, we'll get to this first thing Monday morning, Lord willing. I want my listeners to understand. We'll see you Monday.
The Greatest Prophecy DVD from Cross the Border Productions. Embrace the little-known but greatest prophecy given by the great high priest, the Messiah, reveals the Creator's once secret plan for mankind at the first sacrificial event. Believe it. Behold the end times in Daniel chapter 2, because
the dream is certain, and the interpretation thereof sure.
It is the key to prophecy future. Comprehend the 7-year Great Tribulation deception. Be not deceived. Understand the Great Prophecy delusion, because
if it were possible, they shall deceive the very elect.
Be forewarned. America in prophecy, exposed for all to see. You must see it. The mark of the beast. No, it's not a biochip. A much better and more secure technology is already here, and you are already using it. We will bonus you with a free copy of Richard Bennett's groundbreaking work, The Inquisition, when you send a support donation of $20 to First Amendment Radio. Visit the shopping page at our website or send $20 cash to First Amendment Radio, 139 East Tulare, Tulare Avenue, Tulare, California, 93274. Send your support donation of $20 cash to First Amendment Radio, 139 East Tulare, Tulare, Tulare Avenue, Tulare, California, 93274, or $30 U.S. for international priority mail outside the USA. A wise man is forewarned and prepares for the times to come. Will you be ready? The Greatest Prophecy DVD.